We have a unique privilege tonight to have Sherry Mueller joining us. Sherry Mueller is the Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the School of International Service at American University, where she teaches a graduate practicum entitled Cultural Diplomacy and International Exchange. So we're going to get in about 35 minutes tonight, what she normally takes a semester to do, right? So she currently serves as co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. She served on the boards of World Learning, Friendship Force International, Pixera Global, am I saying that right?
You're saying it exactly right.
And the International Student House in Washington, D.C. So you must know our friends, the Eisenstats, and OSU graduate, so a good friend of our program. She's a member of the School of International Studies Dean's Board at American University. She's previously served as the president of Global Ties U.S. and worked for the Institute of International Education. So it is our privilege. She is quite famous in this area and well-known, and one of the most prominent voices in public diplomacy in the U.S. And so it's our privilege to welcome Sherry Mueller.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's the kind of introduction that you wish your parents were around to hear, right? Thank you, Dean Kluver. I really appreciate that generous introduction. There are so many reasons I'm pleased to be here on the OSU campus with colleagues here in Stillwater and also with our colleagues online at partner institutions in Pueblo. Welcome to you all. Dr. Jamie Fullerton, I'm particularly honored to have accepted your invitation to be here. I'm very much an admirer of the work that Dr. Fullerton does in the field of nation branding, public diplomacy, bridging those terms, and I'm also very proud of her volunteer work with the Tulsa Global Alliance, because I think it's the volunteer work that so complements what you do in your academic and scholarly endeavors. In prep for my visit, I really enjoyed learning about the impressive history of this institution that started in 1890 as the Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College. And I was particularly interested, where are my tour guides? Kara and Harley did a wonderful tour this morning, and one of the places we stopped was to see Henry Bennett's statue. And I was fascinated by his being recruited by President Truman in 1950 to go to Washington, I think it was as an assistant or secretary of state, to head up what was then called the Technical Cooperation Administration. Administered something called Point 4, which was a very big deal at the time and a precursor to our work currently in the U.S. Agency for International Development. So just learning more about his impressive time here and then his global impact was a wonderful story to underpin what I'm learning about the work you're doing now. Growing up, my heroes were always cowboys, okay? And most of you were too young, but there was Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and the Lone Ranger. And so to be on the campus of a place where the mascot is a cowboy, where we are all cowboys together, I enjoyed learning a lot about Frank Eaton and the incredible role he played in the early years of the institution. I also was fascinated to learn that a prominent alumnus is Garth Brooks. And so as part of my prep, I listened to the Thunder Rolls and the dance. And I hate to tell you, I love the Friends in Low Places. But so do we. But the key reason that I really am here and am very honored to be here is because this is the home of the Charles Chic Dambach Fellowship Fund. And established in 2022 has made great strides And I'm lucky enough to count Chic as a, and by the way, I bring greetings. I just got off the phone with him a couple of hours ago. Count Chic is a respected professional colleague and a dear friend. And for those of you who haven't read his memoir, Exhaust the Limits, I'm in it as part of, yes, we were married in Saudi Arabia for a week. So somebody can ask me about that later. But Chic is a consummate citizen diplomat and really gets us into the meat of what we're talking about today. Where is Clinton? Clinton? Yeah, oh, there you are. I love the story, Clinton, of how you happened to be the first recipient of this fellowship, and that it was an OSU t-shirt that somebody gave you that started a Peace Corps volunteer gave you that started a string of events that brought you here. And to me, that wonderful story illustrates how you never know what seed you're planting. I do believe in peace through agriculture, but and I know, and Tabitha, nice to see you again too. I know that Clinton, you embrace the values that Chic and his career have embodied. And I suspect you were all glad to hear the acceptance speech at the Oscars, where Cillian Murphy dedicated his Oscar to the Peacemakers. I thought that was a very special moment. And I love the sign. We had some photos, some photo ops in front of How Will You Change the World? And I had a very large birthday recently. And one of my friends came, and Chic and Kay were there. One of my friends came up to me and said, Sherry, are you still in the business of saving the world? And I said, yes, but at this advanced age, I know how reluctant the world is to be saved. But that's no excuse for not trying. And I know that there are a lot of people in this room who will answer that question in a very positive way. We almost called this presentation, Please Speak to Strangers. And I told this story at the Global Ties conference last week. So Allie and Gary and Jeremy and Moses will have to sit through it again. And I'm sorry about that. But one of the things, I grew up on a farm in northern Illinois. And my biggest claim to fame before I went to go to my undergrad work at the School of International Service at American University was I had won the DuPage County Beef Showmanship Trophy in 4-H, not once but twice. Okay? And so there was nothing international in my background until my 4-H leader was one of the first farmers to go to the then Soviet Union on a farmer-to-farmer exchange. That was one of the first exchanges that came out of a Soviet-American cultural pact that was signed back in 1958. I don't know what was so impactful about the slides he brought back to our club. I just knew I was never the same after that. I think I expected their wheat to be red or something, but the familiarity of the visions, and I subsequently went to the Soviet Union a number of times on exchange programs, and I signed up as a result of Mr. Schramer's efforts to show the slides and try to help us understand the great impact that had had on him as one of those first participants. And so I signed up for an experiment, an international living youth exchange program to live in Germany for a summer with a family. And I knew no one in Germany. I didn't know my group leader. I didn't know the Americans in my group. And the last thing Mom said to me at O'Hare Airport when she and my dad took me there to catch a plane to go to New York to catch a student ship, it was that long ago, okay? She said, Sherry, remember, don't speak to strangers. So I have made a career out of speaking to strangers and encouraging and training other people to do it, hopefully effectively. And that theme will run through my comments today. I believe that we as a country really need to ramp up our efforts to speak to strangers and our ability to do it. Now, I have 3 questions for the audience as part of my presentation. The first question for you is, how many of you think of yourselves as citizen diplomats? Hands, please. Okay. Citizen diplomacy is one way to define it, is the concept that the individual has the responsibility, has the right, even the responsibility, to help shape foreign relations. We used to say one handshake at a time, and hopefully we'll get back to that. We all really are citizen diplomats. Most of us don't think of ourselves that way, but whatever you say, whether it's online or whether it's in person, whatever you do, whatever photos you post, you are constantly helping others develop their idea of your country and your culture. We all really are citizen diplomats. There are 2 types of citizen diplomacy. One I define as spontaneous. You're on a street corner in Washington and you see people poring over their phone, and they're obviously trying to figure out why there are 2 15th Streets, but and you go up and you say, may I help you? The other type of citizen diplomacy I refer to as deliberate citizen diplomacy. You make an effort, most likely as part of an exchange program, to have some orientation, to deliberately choose a program. And I think often the role of the individual in international affairs is underestimated. And yet, if anything, it's grown dramatically. I mean, one person can cause a major international incident. Probably the miracle is not more of those have happened than already did. One of the assignments I like to give my students is to read an article, and I will give it all to you when you get home. Google an article called Requisite, let's see, it's by Elihu Root, who was Secretary of War under President McKinley and Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt. And in 1922, in the first issue of Foreign Affairs ever published, he wrote this. And I want you to listen to it very carefully and to substitute the term social media for yellow journals and see whether you think this resonates. Remember, he did this more than a century ago. He said, political demagogues, or he wrote, political demagogues will seek popularity by public speeches full of insult to foreign countries. And yellow journals will seek to increase their circulation by appeals to prejudice against foreigners. Such public expressions bring discredit upon our country and injure its business and imperil its peace. They will practically cease whenever the American public condemns them. That will come when the American public more fully understands international relations. Unfortunately, it still resonates. It still rings true. The American public still hasn't grasped as much as they need to make wise decisions about foreign relations. And I think it's ironic but understandable that generals are often the biggest supporters of citizen diplomacy and international exchange. They've seen war firsthand. They grasp its stupidity and its long-term consequences. I'm thinking, who did I speak to who's going to be working with refugees in Slovakia? Yes, an example of how wars are so much more costly than even the horrible amounts of billions of dollars that appear in the beginning. President Eisenhower was a particular supporter of citizen diplomacy, and he conducted a White House summit on citizen diplomacy in 1956. Got a lot of business people together, Hallmark cards. It's one of the reasons the People-to-People organization was headquartered in Kansas City. But listen to what he said, because I think his call to action still applies. He says, clearly there will never be enough diplomats and information officers at work in the world to get the job done without the help from the rest of us. And he goes on, he talks about if our American ideology is to survive, it must have the active support of thousands of independent private groups and institutions and millions of individual Americans acting through person-to-person communication in foreign lands. And he goes on to say, and listen carefully, because I wish we had more current statesmen saying these things, although I do think our current Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy does articulate this reasonably well. If we are going to take advantage of the assumption that all people want peace, then the problem is for people to get together and leap governments, if necessary, to evade governments, to work out not only one method, but thousands of methods by which people can gradually learn a bit more of each other. I'm talking about the exchange of professors and students and executives, the providing of technical assistance, and of the ordinary traveler abroad. It was interesting that for the Public Diplomacy Council of America, we hosted Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, and he literally at this meeting, October 31st, echoed what Eisenhower said. He talked about the need to increase the non-military aspects of U.S. power. And he, conscious of your background in all things Asian, Randy, Dean Kluver, he said, the Chinese are running rings around us. That's his quote. And he used as an example the Luban workshops, where he said they have 30 of these in 25 countries, and it's kind of like taking our American community college model almost, and doing vocational training and things like servicing electric vehicles and managing commercial drones, things like that. Second major question for all of you, do you agree with this statement? China and the United States are the largest developing and developed countries in the world, and the future and destiny of this planet require Sino-US relations to be more stable. Anybody know who said that? Do you agree with it? Okay. That's Xi Jinping in a letter to Sarah Landy, one of his Iowa friends. I want to suggest to all of you that you watch the PBS documentary called Citizen Diplomacy that just came out. It's Iowa-centric. I suspect there could be an Oklahoma version with no trouble at all. There's already a Minnesota one in the works. And one of the stories that are told in this documentary, and I've been lucky enough to interview some of the people in my own research who are in the documentary. And I'll come back to Xi Jinping in a minute, but some of you may be familiar with the farmer who hosted Khrushchev back in 1959. And the movie starts out with his granddaughter and her reminiscences about her father and this over 10-year relationship that this farmer Roswell Garst, who wanted to sell seed corn to the then Soviet Union, had with the Khrushchev family. and sometimes against the State Department's wishes. He interacted with the head of state. It's a fascinating story, and the relationships that have come out of these stories that continue to this day are particularly intriguing, I think. So I recommend that PBS special. Another story there that is told is about Xi Jinping and his time in Iowa living with a family in Muscatine. And he came as head of a corn processing delegation in 1985. And then he came back in 2012, and in between there were Iowans, his friends, who would go to China, some as his guests. And you may have read that he hosted some of those friends at the APEC conference in San Francisco just last November. So this story, there's a wonderful friend who, like Chic Dambach, is a consummate citizen diplomat, is Ambassador Kenneth Quinn, and I hope you all will become more familiar with him as well. He had a very distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, ended his career as our ambassador to Cambodia, and then spent 20 years as head of the World Food Prize. And he works very hard, along with others, at the U.S. Heartland China Association, to really be sure that we do not lose touch, that we're maintaining Chinese contacts between China and the United States. They called it, in a really interesting session on the future of U.S.-China relations, finding the balance between Pollyanna and paranoia, which I thought was a nice way to think about it. His mantra is peace through agriculture, and he'll remind folks that, hey, the Chinese bought somewhere between $7 and $9 billion worth of soy products from Iowa last year. And for Iowa, that is a huge deal. And I think it's the work that he and others are doing to really maintain those relationships almost under the radar is tremendously important. And that the more we can do, more citizen diplomacy that exists, the safer we'll all be. I wanted to just make a comment about public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy and the difference. And I'm quick to add that definitions, as Dr. Fullerton and I have discovered and discussed, these definitions shift. Different schools of international affairs might define it differently. Certainly when I teach back at American University, I talk about public diplomacy as funding from the U.S. government for things like the Fulbright program, the International Visitor Leadership Program, the Voice of America, various cultural exchange programs abroad. Funding that public diplomacy is government-funded activity to help shape public opinion abroad. I would argue that citizen diplomacy is both sometimes part of public diplomacy and sometimes moves well beyond it. And the example of Ambassador Quinn would be a good one. A good example of where they're combined would be, and some of you have participated in the International Visitor Leadership Program of our State Department, or have been involved in Global Ties membership, as in the Tulsa Global Alliance or the Oklahoma City Group. And for example, that's a government-funded program, so I would argue it's part of the U.S. toolkit in public diplomacy. But it does involve to offer home hospitality, to offer professional meetings, community events. It involves volunteer citizen diplomats. So that would be a good example of where they mesh. But there are so many other programs that are independent of government funding that nonetheless help shape another country's opinion of the United States or vice versa. Just before I leave China, one of the things I think is helpful to think about, particularly for the American students in the room, if the world consisted of 100 people, only 5 would live in the US, 30 would live in China. What don't we get about needing to interact with them in a constructive way? And it saddens me very much that both political parties get a lot of mileage out of bashing China. And I just don't believe bashing helps either side. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that. I know I have experts in the room who can help. I wanted to just say a word. Sometimes people say, well, you know, what are some of the characteristics or the ways to look at measure success? And I would argue that actually, whether you're talking about public diplomacy, educational exchange, cultural diplomacy, the 3 R's I'm going to describe really capture that. The first R, and some of you are old enough to know what the original 3 R's were, and we'll save that for later. First R in this case is relationship building. Exchanges, citizen diplomacy at its best, builds long-term relationships. And those relationships are the web of human connections that makes coming to climate accords or trade agreements or security pacts more likely to happen in a constructive way. It requires honest communication, and some of you know the reference in the title that we did choose for today, the last 3 feet. How many of you have heard that term or know what it is? Okay, a few of you. Some of you will remember a very famous journalist named Edward R. Murrow, who started his career, interestingly enough, at the Institute of International Education, rescuing scholars, had a brilliant career with CBS, and ended his career as director of what was the United States Information Agency. And he always talked about the most important distance in communication is the last 3 feet. Between you and another person, now it's come between you and your computer screen if you're in a Zoom meeting. But the last 3 feet has, I think, some real significance. I don't think we will ever replace the value of face-to-face communication, but it's certainly helpful to have the digital world at our disposal. One other, and the people who gave me, Harley and Kara know I love quotes, so I was in heaven on the elevators in the business school. And one of my favorite quotes about communication is by George Bernard Shaw. Where's Jemima? Okay. All right. You probably know this one. The biggest obstacle to communication is the illusion that it has occurred. And I think all of us sometimes need to step back and say, did I really reach across that 3 feet? Second R, reciprocity. We need to get out of the donor-recipient relationship and think more. I did like the partnerships part of the name of the school a lot because I'm a great believer that approach, whether you're talking about international exchanges or other programs, is very helpful. Some of you would remember if you ever went to USIA's building in Washington, it had a plaque on the wall that said, it was a brass plaque, it said, "Telling America's Story." And one of the things, I went in that building so many times because I worked for one of the program agencies. When I was also part of Global Ties, we were the private sector partner to the U.S., to USIA. And I always wanted to rewrite that plaque and say, "Telling America's story is done best by good listeners." Because it's so important to learn active listening, to be aware of the values that you project by who you are and how you what you model. And I always train my staff to ask themselves, what does the way we manage this exchange program convey to the participant? How the way they watch us treat them and each other probably tells them so much more than the best speaker we could possibly invite to explain to them what U.S. cultural values are. Finally, the third R, the relentless search for common ground. And that's not my term. I actually heard President Clinton say it when he received the Fulbright Prize back in the mid-90s. But it brings up, I think, a wonderful question, which is, how do you find the common ground? And I always think, I was in Tucson visiting an Air Force base, talking to the foreign pilots as well as the American pilots who were training them to fly F-16s. This was before the pandemic. And I asked them, how do you establish rapport? This is a guy who's going to be flying an F-16 that's going to be 12 feet away from your wingtip to wingtip. You really have to be confident of your ability to establish rapport and find that common ground. Finally, a couple of comments on the third question I have for all of you. Do you think of higher education as an export? How many view it that way? Okay. 40% of the university students in the Netherlands are not Dutch. And other countries at the national level, I think all universities, almost all universities, appreciate the need to attract international students for financial reasons, for cultural reasons, for educational reasons. And a few countries have overdone it, like Canada and Australia, for example. But in the US, we actually, when I first started looking at this in 1993, we had 40% of all international students in the world studied here. It was down to 17% of market share before the pandemic. We're still the biggest host country at, and those of you who really are interested in these things, go to Fast Facts at Institute of International Education, IIE.org, because they lay all this out for you. But the latest statistic is we have 1,057,000 international students in the US. And that generates 368,000 jobs and $38 billion of revenue. So thinking of higher and trying to help our members of Congress think of higher education as an export, I think is a really useful activity. Finally, I just want to share, I was asked, because I was an undergraduate handing out programs back in 1963 at American University when President John F. Kennedy gave the commencement address. And it was called his major foreign policy speech. It was called his peace speech. But so in the process of getting ready, I re-listened, I watched it on YouTube. If you haven't watched it, and I'm sure our younger colleagues probably are thinking, who? But trust me on this, you won't believe how articulate and statesmanlike that speech is. And in it, he makes 3 observations. I think there are 3 lessons for all of us involved in public diplomacy, in international exchange, in citizen diplomacy. The first one is we must acknowledge our interdependence. He talked about trying to get a very practical kind of peace, and he said, genuine peace must be the product of many nations. Secondly, he underscored the fact that we need to distinguish between the actions of a government and the accomplishments of a people. And he was pretty harsh in some ways on the then Soviet Union. But he also took the time to hail the Russians for the fact that they had more casualties during World War II than any other nation. and for their achievements in history, in literature, in art, in science, I meant to say. And that, I think it's important because it lets you be more relaxed as a citizen diplomat if you make that distinction. Finally, and I think this is sort of the heart of what he had to say, he said you need to underscore our differences and yes, admit them. And often I think when we do things with international students, we try to appreciate and highlight the positive parts of those differences. But I think it's even more important, and he stressed it, to focus on common human aspirations. And listen to this, how he said this. If we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. So I'll leave you pondering that. Urge you again, please speak to strangers. And thank you for being such a wonderful, attentive audience.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, we'll take a few
Okay.
questions.
All right.
Because Monica will send some questions. Okay, so because I have the mic, I get to ask the first question.
Uh-oh.
Thank you for talking particularly about the educational environment. I consider it an exceptional privilege to be able to spend my career in an environment where people from around the world come together, work on common problems, address common problems, and learn from one another. I would like for you to maybe expand a little bit. What do you see as the long-term impact? It's not just that short-term people of coming together and studying and learning together, but what is the long-term impact of that over decades of that kind of educational exchange?
Well, I was just, I'm trying to remember the context, Dean Kluver, but it was I was talking to some American diplomats, and they were saying, they were working on an issue, and they were saying, I discovered that someone had had a Fulbright, and they were so much more open to our point of view. I think we underestimate how valuable it is to have alumni of programs, assuming, though, that they had a good time while they were here. And there's a really great, it's a sad article, but it's a useful article that appeared in the Economist journal called, I think it's 1843, it's their cultural thing, and it was called Alienation 101. And it was when you have international students, but it doesn't go as well as you thought, because maybe there are so many from one culture that they don't interact the way all of us who are involved in study abroad think the interaction should take place. But on balance, I'd say the negatives are far outweighed by the helpfulness when you run into someone who understands more about your culture, who understands more about the history of your country. And that works in all directions. There's a great book by former diplomat John Dixon called History Shock, about how Americans desperately need to read their history. And Jim, you and I were talking about we've lost US diplomatic history, we've lost civics. We need to get back to teaching more of that. But I'm glad to have any of you and any professors here add to that. I don't believe in monopolizing, even though I'm wearing 2 mics. I'm glad to have other comments about that or how it worked in another context.
Well, in that context, I'd like to point out Jerry All, who created the first study abroad program at Oklahoma State.
Ah.
An initiative, right. So, and so, of course, it's not just international students coming to the U.S. It's also our students, the U.S. students, experiencing the world, which is a
yes, and
tremendous
for
imperative.
I mean, when you look at those statistics, that's very distressing, because even though Xi Jinping said we need 50,000 Americans to study in China, not very many American students are studying there, and
We've got about 300 right now.
I mean, think of our population and how large it is, and what tiny percent of eligible students study abroad. So for those of you who have done it, I congratulate you. And if you haven't, please be thinking about it.
And ask us for scholarships, because they're available.
Yeah.
Other questions from the audience or from, yes?
I have one.
Okay.
If you want me to ask one.
You
In your experience, what would be the top 3 soft skills we need in order to be a successful citizen diplomat?
Great question. Glad to have at it, and glad to have anyone else add to them. People, and because I've done I don't know where the book went, but I've co-authored a book on working world careers in international education, exchange, and development with a young colleague, and I do career talks from time to time. And one of the questions, which is like this, is what do you need to succeed in an international career? And I would argue the answers both for soft skills and what you need for an international career are pretty much what you need anytime, unless you're isolated looking through a microscope all by yourself. I think curiosity, well, no, let me back up. Honesty. Remember we talked about honest communication in the last 3 feet? Other people have to be able to, if you tell them, I will do this, they know you will do that. It's a very simple, sort of simple thing, but I often have really good discussions of what is professionalism with my students, and at the top of the list is always, if you tell me you've done it, I can count on the fact that you've done it. The other soft skills, I think curiosity. The thing that it makes people, interesting people in general, is that they continue to learn. They continue to ask questions. They continue to, I always tell my students, wear 2 hats. You're experiencing something, and then you're looking at it from the vantage point of a student of the process. So that I would say this desire to learn that should never go away, even when you've graduated, of course. And then I referred to it a little bit, but communication skills, the ability to give oral presentations, the ability to write well, and know when to use AI and when not to, and active listening, the ability to stop, not think about what you're going to say next, but grasp what someone is saying in words and what they're saying in body language and other cultural cues in a particular environment. So I'll stop there because we're on one of my favorite topics and it's very dangerous and nobody else will get to ask a question other than soft skills. But I don't like the term soft. I wish Joe Nye had called soft power something else because it's so important. It's what Nick Cull, a wonderful professor who serves on the board of the Public Diplomacy Council of America, he calls reputational security, which is a bit broader than I think Joe Nye meant, but it captures the idea that if people are attracted to you for your culture, for the values that you are known for, that is such an asset in international relations. And that's why I go back to my comments about Elihu Root, who wrote that article. Read the article. It's so scary that it still resonates 100 years later. I mean, what? Anyway, all right. Yes, Kara.
Sherry, thank you.
Sure.
recently, in November, my husband and I traveled to Egypt and Jordan, shortly about 2 months after the Hamas and Israeli conflict started. And before going, everyone looked at us and said, "What are you doing? You're crazy. They hate us. You know, we got jokes. Tell them you're Canadian." And we actually found the complete opposite. We were very warmly welcomed. Everyone was very happy to see us. So my question for you is, not only how do we convince foreign audiences to like us, but how do we convince people of the United States that not everyone hates us?
I think, Kara, one of the elements of that, and there are lots of elements because some people genuinely hate us. And gosh, who was that? It was a scholar who talked about kind of general dislike and then real upset with us on a whole new level, and that the percentage that fell into the upset on a whole new level was particularly high. Even though Pew Research studies and other things give us clues about that, and just reading newspapers from around the world or listening, going on websites, give us clues. My experience is like yours. I've gone to countries and people are pretty good at separating out what they feel about the US government and what they feel about the American they're interacting with. And I think there's still an incredible, people want to believe the best of us. And when they see a friendly American who genuinely wants to learn, they're very forgiving. I think we have such a culture of fear and so many people feeding that one of the challenges is getting American students to study abroad. And one of the things I have fun discussing with people who are steeped in exchange programs is when I took a group on the Experiment in International Living to the then Soviet Union. This was 1969. I was a grad student myself, but I had undergrads with me. There were 12 of us. We lived in the sports camp of the Kiev Medical Institute. Everybody had to have a minimum of 2 years of Russian. And a couple of the American young ladies came to me and said, "We cannot deal with the facilities." And we won't go into descriptions. And I said, "Look, I was a group leader, give it 3 days. If you feel the same way, I'll get you out of here." They wanted to go home. And now I think, okay, fast forward decades, those girls would be on the phone, on the internet, one way or another, with their parents insisting they come home. And so my question is, can you have a real immersion experience anymore? And how do those of us who are involved in orientation and evaluating these kinds of programs help young people deal with that and appreciate their own resilience? They don't have to go home right away. They can survive this kind of thing. So your question brings a lot of questions about how do we just get over. I mean, I've been lucky enough to travel in some places and, people will say, "Well, why do you want to go there?" Because I'm curious, Yes, next.
My question kind of follows up on that. I feel like in this world that truly is getting smaller and smaller, America, unfortunately, seems to be becoming more and more isolated. When I talk to young people about how wonderful it is to live overseas, I get that same reaction. Why would you ever want to do that? Mm-hmm. And I am disheartened at, instead of moving forward, we're moving backward in this.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Whoa, if I could answer that.
Scholarships.
Couple of thoughts, though. I get a little uneasy with the concept that the world is getting smaller. And I often will say, how many of you have been to Disney World and seen It's a Small World after all? How many of you? Some, yeah, okay. I hate that song. Not because the concept that they had isn't right. It's correct. We want to learn about other cultures. But because the world of the individual has grown so dramatically, you have so much more, information. I mean, just think about it. You've beat Thomas Jefferson over and over, you know? Our worlds are so large now. The challenge is how do we process the way we get so many chunks of information from so many places? And what can the human brain handle? There's a professor of communication at MIT. I'd urge you all to look at Sherry Turkle's stuff. She handles this, and she talks about the essential nature of getting off your devices. Because I think part of what you're identifying is that the algorithms are set up. I mean, if you really want to read a book that will scare you, read Zucked. The algorithms are set up so that the fear is what is extrapolated and expanded and accelerated. And sometimes when I think about it, I don't think we're as divided. I mean, when I can sit down with some colleagues who share different ideas than I do and talk about politics with them, usually we can find a few things to agree on. But this notion from some of our politicians, well, we're not going to talk to them. I mean, that's insane. And I would argue that it's important to get involved in the political process, as discouraging as it may be, because if we don't, who will? I wrote an article called The Art of Advocacy on what I learned from trying to impact these things when I was president of Global Ties. And I think it's not enough, if you're part of an organization, it's never enough to just provide good programs. You've got to be affecting the policy environment within which those programs are developed and provided. But you raise an excellent question, and one that's we all need to be grappling with, talking more about, and I guess I'll always come back to please speak to strangers. We've got to be talking to the people who disagree with us on whatever level. Anyway.
So for our final question, we have one more from our audience in Puebla.
Yeah, so another question from our audience in Mexico. Do you think we are moving from reciprocity to equitability?
And I don't know exactly what is meant by equitability, a kind of, I think we're getting better at it, and maybe I suspect, hopefully, I'm guessing correctly that person by equitability means partnerships and thinking of the people who come to an exchange program, whether you're a host, whether you're a participant, that you really feel that a partnership as opposed to a kind of donor-donee relationship. So I hope we are. I think we are. I hope, I suspect the ethos of this school is that we are moving in that direction. Is that right, Dean Kluver?
We hope so. Thank you.
Our students didn't get to ask a question. Could you take a question from them, and then we'll wrap it up?
One final question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so most of the questions have been about exchange, but then mine would divert a little bit to your work with the Department of State.
To what?
Your work with the Department of State.
Yes.
So I don't know if you're aware of this, but then recently there have been anti-LGBTQ waves across Africa, and a lot of countries have passed, quite a number of countries have passed legislations against LGBTQ. The first is Kenya, followed by Tanzania, Uganda, and just last week, the famous, my own country, Ghana, have equally passed the bill, which is currently before the president to be signed into law. And when the international community tries to talk, especially your Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, when he tries to talk, our legislators actually came hard on him, and they are all ready to sever ties with the U.S. join China and Russia to form new alliance, and almost all African countries are quite ready to sever ties with the U.S. Is that a worry to you? And considering your work with the Department of State, how do you think U.S. can do better to gain back the trust of African countries?
Interesting question, Clinton. I do not work for the U.S. Department of State. I work at American University now teaching, but I also for years worked with a contractor, a program, a partner to the U.S. Department of State. So in an NGO environment, and that's where I'm most, most comfortable, most familiar. The State Department's bureaucracy is a little bit overwhelming to me. You raise a really interesting question, and I happen to be Methodist, and I'm thinking of the schism in the Methodist Church worldwide now because of differing views of the way LGBT folks should be treated and the extent to which they should be married or ordained. In the US, I think we've made good progress on this. How much of that progress we should try to instill in other countries is a question that would really require a lot more consideration than I can give it right now. I just met with 23 world leaders, NGO leaders from around the world last week on the International Visitor Leadership Program. One of them was from Albania, LGBT. She was head of an LGBT organization. And I do congratulate our State Department for inviting her and helping deal with the issue. Sometimes I think, are we putting them in danger because we're inviting them to deal with something that's so, but it's their choice. But this whole issue of how much should another country try to take values they embrace, and not everybody, it's even hard to find a value that everybody in a country embraces. How much should that be shared? Yes. Pushed? We really need to have more serious discussions about that. You raise an excellent question, but I don't have a silver bullet answer for it. And it's one every time I meet with NGO leaders, and we're hosting people who are trying to bring more human rights to their own countries. But how quickly can another culture with other traditions adopt that? And what should a foreign country's role be in encouraging it? Those are the stuff of much more time, a discussion that is much more time than we have for now. But really good questions, and I thank you and remind you all to please speak to strangers.
So on behalf of Oklahoma State University, we've got a gift for you.
Thank you.
And we can assure you, you have friends in low places. So thank you again for being here. And thank you all for joining us tonight, including those from our sister institution in Puebla.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great time.